The summer began with a sense of normalcy that was, in hindsight, nothing but a quiet prelude to the storm that would soon shake the foundations of my life. I can still remember the smell of the grass as it was freshly cut, the warmth of the sun on my face as I sat on the porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. It was the kind of summer where time seemed to stretch endlessly, and I had no reason to think anything would change. My father, always the stoic figure in my life, was at his usual post in his study, his work consuming him as it always had. My mother, vibrant and full of life, was around, but there was a certain distance in her demeanor, something I couldn't quite place at the time. It was during one of these afternoons, as I sat on the porch with my thoughts, that my mother came to me with a decision that would alter everything. She had received a job offer, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that she couldn't pass up. As a scientist, her career had always been something she was passionate about, and this job was the pinnacle of her aspirations. But there was one catch: it would require her to leave for several months, to work in a distant city, far from the family that had always been her anchor. I remember her excitement when she told me. She was practically glowing, her eyes shining with the promise of what was to come. I was happy for her in a way, but there was an underlying fear I couldn't shake. I had never known a world without my mother's presence, without her gentle guidance and nurturing. And now, I would have to face a summer, possibly more, without her. "Mom, are you sure?" I asked, trying to mask the worry in my voice. "What about Dad? What about us?" My mother's smile faltered for a moment, and she glanced over at my father, who was sitting in his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper. He looked up briefly, meeting her eyes, and then returned to his paper. It was a momentary exchange, one that I would later come to realize was filled with more unspoken words than I could understand at the time. "It's what I've worked for, honey," she said softly. "It's a chance I can't pass up." I nodded, knowing that her mind was made up. My mother was always driven, always striving for the next challenge, the next discovery. I admired her for it, even if I couldn't fully understand the implications it would have on our family dynamic. The truth was, I had grown up with the notion that my parents' relationship was strong, unbreakable even. But this decision was the first crack in that belief. As the days passed, I tried to adjust to the idea of my mother being gone. The house felt quieter, emptier, and the absence of her laughter, her voice, left a hollow space in the air. But there was also a strange sense of anticipation building within me. My father, usually so consumed with work, was suddenly all I had. And I thought, perhaps naively, that this would be our chance to connect, to spend time together as a family. But as the weeks went by, my hopes began to falter. My father, instead of being more present, became even more distant. I had always known him as the quiet, methodical type, but now there was a coldness to him, a palpable separation that I couldn't bridge. He would spend long hours locked away in his study, his work piling up as if he were avoiding something, someone. I tried desperately to reach out to him, to engage him in conversation, but it was as if he couldn't, or wouldn't hear me. I remember one evening in particular. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. I had finished my homework and decided to find my father. I made my way to his study, expecting to find him hunched over his desk as usual, but when I knocked and received no response, I slowly pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tightly against the light of the setting sun. My father sat at his desk, his back to me, the only sound in the room being the scratch of his pen on paper. But there was something different about the way he sat, his shoulders slumped, his posture hunched. He looked defeated. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to interrupt, but something inside me urged me forward. "Dad." I called softly, my voice uncertain. He didn't turn around immediately. For a moment, there was silence. And then slowly, he set his pen down and sighed. "Come in," he said, his voice rough, almost tired. I stepped inside, feeling a strange tension in the air. He didn't look at me, didn't offer any words of comfort. Instead, his gaze was fixed on something on his desk, a small photograph framed and worn, as though it had been touched many times. I approached slowly, unsure of what I would find, but when I caught sight of the photograph, my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of my mother, taken years ago, before I was born. She was younger, radiant with youth, her eyes filled with something I had never seen before, something other than the affection she had for my father. There was another man in the photo, his face partially obscured by the way the picture had aged, but I could see enough to recognize that he wasn't my father. The realization hit me like a wave, cold and sudden. My mother had been with someone else. She had betrayed my father, and by extension me. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The world seemed to shift beneath my feet. The life I had known, the safety I had felt, was suddenly a lie. I didn't know how to process what I was seeing, what I was feeling. But I couldn't deny it. My father had known. He had been carrying this weight for years, silently suffering while I remained oblivious. "Dad," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, but I could see the way his hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes distant, lost in the memories. I didn't know what to say. There were no words to make sense of this new reality. All I could do was stand there, feeling the distance between us grow even more. I turned and left the room, retreating to my own sanctuary, my bedroom, where I could fall apart in private. The tears came without warning, streaming down my face as I lay on the bed, the weight of the world pressing down on me. How could my mother do this? How could she betray my father like that? And how could I not have seen it before? That night, sleep eluded me. My mind was too full of questions, too full of pain. The one thing I knew for certain was that my life, my family, would never be the same again. Would you like me to continue expanding on this, or would you prefer the rest of the episodes in a similar style? Each episode would be rich in emotion and exploration, developing both the inner turmoil of the narrator and the complexities of their relationships. The days that followed that evening were a blur, a mix of numbing confusion and painful realizations. I couldn't shake the image of my mother's photograph from my mind, the man's face still a blur, but the love and tenderness in her eyes unmistakable. I spent hours staring at that photograph in my mind, trying to make sense of what it meant, of how long my father had known, and what it all meant for me. My whole world felt like it was shifting under my feet, like I was standing on unstable ground, unable to find solid footing. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I told myself that everything was fine, that I should just go about my day as usual, but there was no pretending anymore. I could see the change in my father, and I could feel it in myself too. We were no longer the family I had known. We were strangers, bound together by a shared pain neither of us knew how to deal with. When I saw him at breakfast, he was the same as always, distant, his eyes downcast as he poked at his food with his fork, not saying a word. The silence between us was suffocating. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who were at ease with one another, but the heavy, uncomfortable silence of two people who didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between them. "Dad," I said, my voice breaking the silence, though I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. The words were lodged in my throat, tangled in a web of emotion that I couldn't untangle. "Are you okay?" He didn't look up at first. He continued to eat, his movements mechanical. It was as if he couldn't hear me, as if he was in some other place entirely. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed and set his fork down. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes dark and tired. "I'm fine," he said, but I could hear the weariness in his voice, the lie that was too thin to cover the truth. I didn't press him. I knew better than to push too hard. My father had always been the type to keep his feelings buried deep, locked away in some hidden part of himself. But I couldn't help it. I needed to know. I needed to understand what was going on inside his head. "Dad," I stopped myself. How could I ask him about the photograph? How could I bring up something so personal, so painful? But the words were there, pressing against my lips, and I couldn't hold them back anymore. "I saw the photograph last night." His expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't show any sign that he had been expecting me to bring it up. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. "I know you did," he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. I didn't want you to find out that way, but I suppose it was inevitable. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. Who was he? The man in the picture? I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Was he the reason you? I couldn't bring myself to say it. I couldn't bring myself to say the word betrayal. My father looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if weighing whether or not he should answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. He was someone your mother loved before we met, he said. Someone she never truly got over. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. The man in the photograph wasn't just some stranger. He was someone my mother had loved, someone she had loved deeply, someone she had never truly let go of. It was a gut punch, a revelation that sent a wave of nausea through me. But why? I whispered. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you tell me that she... I couldn't, my father interrupted, his voice raw. I couldn't tell you because I didn't want you to hate her. I didn't want you to think less of her. She's your mother, and I didn't want to take that away from you. I wanted you to love her the way I do. But you're hurting, I said, the words coming out more sharply than I intended. I see it. You're in pain. And I'm in pain too. I don't know how to help you. He nodded slowly, his face softening with a kind of sadness that I had never seen before. It was as if the man I had always known, strong, steady, unflappable, was unraveling before me. And I didn't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix it either, he said quietly. I don't know if I can. But I don't want you to carry this weight alone. I don't want you to feel like you have to protect me, or take care of me. I'm your father, and it's my job to take care of you. I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that I understood, that we would get through this together. But I didn't know how. There was too much between us now, too much unspoken pain, too many things that we couldn't say out loud. For the rest of the day, I kept my distance. I didn't want to crowd him, didn't want to make things worse by pushing him when he wasn't ready to talk. I spent most of my time in my room, trying to process everything that had happened. I thought about my mother, about how I had always looked up to her, admired her strength and intelligence. How could she have betrayed my father like that? How could she have kept such a secret from me? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the house, I found myself sitting by the window, staring out into the fading light. My mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, but there was one thing that kept circling back to me. The photograph. My mother's love for that man. The fact that she had never really let him go. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop wondering how my father had dealt with it all these years. How had he lived with the knowledge that the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, had never truly been his? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I knew about my parents, about their lives before I was born. I had always seen them as the solid foundation of my world, the people who had it all together, the ones who never wavered. But now I saw them differently. They were human, just like me. They had flaws, they had mistakes, and they had secrets. I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The next day, I decided to confront my mother. I couldn't let this lie between us any longer. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened, what had driven her to betray my father in such a way. And so, I made the decision to talk to her. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination that felt almost foreign to me. I had spent the night thinking about my mother, about the woman she had been before everything had changed, before the betrayal, before the photograph, before the silence. I had always admired her strength, her poise, her ability to keep everything together. But now, with the truth exposed, I couldn't ignore the cracks in the facade anymore. She wasn't perfect. She was flawed, like all of us. And it was time for me to confront her. I dressed quickly, trying to shake off the gnawing anxiety that had settled in my chest. The sun was already high in the sky, and I knew she would be in her study, working as usual. She always buried herself in her work, especially when things got tough. I couldn't blame her, it was how she coped. But today, I needed her to face me, to look me in the eye and answer the questions that had been plaguing me for days. I walked downstairs, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The house felt eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I found my mother in her study, as I had expected. She was hunched over her desk, papers scattered around her, her pen moving quickly across the page. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was as if I wasn't even there. "Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "We need to talk." She paused, her pen stilling in her hand. Slowly, she looked up at me, her expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence between us, thick with tension, before she finally spoke. "I suppose this is about your father," she said quietly, her voice calm, but I could hear the underlying strain. "You know, don't you?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know about the photograph. I know about him, the man in it." Her face softened for a moment, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. But it wasn't the kind of sadness that came from guilt. It was the kind of sadness that came from regret, from years of secrets buried so deep that even she had forgotten where they were. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But yes, it's true. There was someone else before your father. Someone I loved." I felt a wave of anger surge through me, but I fought it down. This wasn't the time for anger. I needed answers, not accusations. I needed to understand. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" She took a deep breath, her hands folding in her lap as she seemed to search for the right words. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said finally. "I didn't want you to think less of me. I didn't want you to see me as imperfect. I wanted to be your mother, the one you could always look up to, the one you could trust. I didn't want to shatter that image." I could feel my chest tighten, the weight of her words sinking in. She hadn't wanted to hurt me, but in her attempt to protect me from the truth, she had done the exact opposite. She had shattered the trust we had, the trust that had taken years to build. "But you hurt Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You hurt him in ways that I can't even imagine. You betrayed him." She flinched, the guilt evident on her face. "I know," she said softly. "I've carried that guilt for so long, it feels like it's part of me now. But what you don't understand is that I never stopped loving him. I never stopped caring about him. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But I never stopped loving your father." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. "Then why? Why did you do it? Why did you let it go on for so long?" She looked away, her eyes clouding with something I couldn't quite place, shame, regret, perhaps both. "Because I thought I could have both worlds. I thought I could love your father and still hold on to the past. I thought I could keep that part of me hidden, locked away, and still have the family I wanted. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. It was the first time I had seen her vulnerable, the first time I had seen her so exposed. And for a moment, I felt a wave of compassion wash over me. She wasn't a perfect mother, but she was still my mother. And she was still hurting, still grappling with the consequences of her actions. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't know how to make it right. But I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I felt my anger begin to fade, replaced by something softer, something more complicated. I didn't know if I could forgive her, not yet. But I knew that this conversation, this moment, was the beginning of something. It was the beginning of a healing process that would take time, a process that would require patience and understanding from both of us. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," I said honestly. "But I want to try. I want to understand. I want us to figure this out, even if it takes time." She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I caused you and your father." I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. It felt like the ground had shifted again, like we were standing on different soil now, unsure of what came next. But at least we had taken the first step. We had talked. We had faced the truth. As I turned to leave, I paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. "I'm not sure where we go from here," I said softly. "But I hope we can find a way to heal. Together." She didn't respond, but I could see the hope in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we might be able to move forward. Slowly, carefully, but forward nonetheless. The days that followed our conversation were strange, almost surreal. It felt like the world around me had slowed down, as if everything had taken a step back to allow us time to process what had been revealed. My mother, for the first time in what seemed like years, wasn't hiding behind the walls of her work. She spent more time at home, trying to make amends, to rebuild the relationship that had been fractured between us. It was a strange sort of dance, each of us stepping forward with caution, unsure of how to move but determined to find our way. My father, on the other hand, was a different story. I had expected him to remain distant, to bury himself in his work as he always did. But there was something in his eyes now, something I hadn't seen before. It was a glimmer of hope, though it was faint. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of possibility. We could heal. We could rebuild. It was a Sunday afternoon when my father and I had our first real conversation about everything. The weather was warm, the kind of afternoon that made you want to spend the day outside, but we sat in the living room, the quiet between us thick with unspoken words. My father sat in his favorite armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window as if lost in thought. I sat across from him, my legs curled beneath me on the couch, waiting for him to speak. He didn't look at me right away, but after a long pause, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were difficult to get out. "I should have been there for you. I should have been a better father." I felt my chest tighten. "Dad, you don't need to apologize. You were hurt too. I know that now. And I understand. I don't know how we're supposed to move forward. How do we fix something this broken?" He took a deep breath, looking down at his glass for a moment before setting it aside. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I know that we can try. That's all I've got. We try, and we see where it takes us." I nodded, my heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was a start. And that was all we could ask for. In the days that followed, we found ourselves slipping into a new routine. It wasn't seamless, and it wasn't without its awkward moments, but we began to talk more. Not just about my mother, but about everything. My father, who had always been a man of few words, began to open up in ways I had never seen before. He shared stories from his youth, memories of his own father, and even bits of his work that he had never thought to mention before. I listened intently, soaking in every word, every detail. I realized that I didn't really know him, not the way I had always thought I did. But it wasn't just my father who was changing. I was too. The conversation with my mother had opened something inside of me, something I hadn't even known was there. I was learning to forgive, not just her, but myself. I had spent so much time carrying around anger, resentment, and confusion. I had blamed my mother for everything that had gone wrong, for tearing our family apart. But the truth was, we were all responsible. We were all human. We all made mistakes. And it was in that realization that I began to see a way forward. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It wasn't about pretending that everything was fine. It was about acceptance. About understanding that we could move on, not despite our flaws, but because of them. We could heal because we were willing to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. My mother, too, was making efforts to change. She attended therapy sessions, began to open up more about her past, and even took time to reconnect with me in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't easy for her. It wasn't easy for any of us. But I saw the effort, and I began to appreciate it in ways I hadn't before. One evening, as I sat with my mother in the kitchen, helping her prepare dinner, she turned to me with a serious expression. "I want to make things right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to be the mother you deserve. I don't expect forgiveness right away. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I paused, the knife in my hand stilling for a moment. "I know, Mom. And I'm willing to try too. It's going to take time. But we can try." And so we did. We tried. There were days when the old wounds resurfaced, when the weight of everything felt too much to bear. But we held on. We didn't give up. We communicated. We listened. And slowly, the distance between us began to shrink. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Months passed, and eventually, we found ourselves in a place where we could talk about the past without it feeling like a raw, gaping wound. My father and I spent more time together, going on walks, watching old movies, and sharing memories of the good times we had before everything fell apart. My mother, though still distant in some ways, made efforts to connect with me, to show me that she was trying. She didn't always get it right, but I could see the sincerity in her actions. Then one day, my father and I were sitting together in the garden, watching the sunset. It was a quiet moment, the kind where words weren't necessary. My father, as always, was the first to break the silence. "I don't know if things will ever be the way they were," he said softly. "But I think I'm okay with that. I think I've accepted that we've changed, that we've all grown in different ways. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." I nodded, my heart full. "I think you're right. We can't go back. But we can move forward. Together." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the warmth of the evening sun wrapping around us like a blanket. I knew that we still had a long road ahead of us. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and pain. But I also knew that we had made it through the hardest part. We had faced the truth, and we had chosen to move forward. And as I looked at my father, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We weren't perfect, but we were real. We were a family, bound not by perfection, but by love and resilience. And that was enough. As for my mother, she too was finding her way. It was a journey, one that she would have to walk on her own terms, but I believed in her. I believed in us. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I allowed myself to believe in the future. Not the future I had once imagined, but a new one. One that was still unfolding, still full of possibility. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, we would be okay.